Hello and welcome. I'm Alex Howson, and this is Right Medicine. Angelique Vinther is a data and outcomes consultant with a background in marketing. She recognizes the close connection between the marketing sector and the outcomes side of continuing medical education and continuing education, since both require analytical skills to assess user benefit, behavior, participation, and survey fatigue. In today's episode of Right Medicine, we talk about best practices that education providers can use to evaluate the effectiveness of their continuing medical education programs and how to use these outcomes to inform decision making. We explore solutions to education providers' main challenges in developing robust outcomes frameworks, like establishing an efficient process that allows time to evaluate the quality of feedback and think creatively about activity design. Join us. Hello and welcome. This is Right Medicine, and I'm your host, Alex Howson. And I'm here today with Angelique Vinther, who is an data and outcomes consultant with a special focus on analytics and reporting. Welcome, Angelique.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, let's start with just telling listeners who you are and what your work currently involves.
Right. So, like you said, data and outcomes consultant. I currently am kind of private consulting with a variety of clients and helping them with a variety of different things that fall kind of under outcomes. So helping design their templates or, helping just meet their reporting commitments, or bigger things like kind of helping them develop their outcomes program where they're looking at the grant language, how they want to, frame what their outcomes deliverables will be, how they want to collect that data, what their, methodologies are going to be for analyzing, and then, how they want to present that in their reporting. So sometimes it's, one piece of that, and sometimes it's kind of several pieces of that spectrum.
We're going to dig into some of those pieces in a moment. But first, could you talk a little bit about, I always like to ask people how they ended up in the CME CE world, because it's a little subterranean.
Yeah, and people do tend to fall into it. I haven't heard too many people say that they've been working towards this their whole career, or their whole education or something like that.
Never.
So I've always been interested in a lot of different topics and hobbies and areas of study. I studied environmental science when I was in college, and that was actually part of the interest that pulled me towards that study, was that it was interdisciplinary. So I got to study a lot in poli-sci courses and into science courses, and even a lot of literature. And I just always liked having that variety. That was a big importance for mine. I don't know, I never could relate to people that just had that one thing that they loved, and they knew from an early age that they loved it, and they were just completely 100% immersed and focused on it. So in that sense, I've always been more of a generalist. And when I started my career, I went into marketing, and more on the data side, less on the promotional side, but they kind of bleed together to some extent. And I did marketing for a number of different industries, including like publishing and a tech startup, things like that, that kind of primed me when I was originally hired at a medical education company to help them launch one of their products. And so from that point on, I was working in the marketing department on the data and reporting side, and our outcomes program just kind of grew over time out of the data that we were already working with and the reporting we were doing at the time.
I'm curious about that connection between marketing and outcomes. Could you talk a little bit more about how those two entities talk to each other in the context of CME?
So yes, absolutely. It's a good question, because I actually think outcomes touches a lot of different processes or departments within the process of building the education. But marketing is a key one too, because they're reaching the target audience, and you're really wanting to show that in your outcomes report, that you're educating the right people and things like that. So the way they're looking at their distribution, the way they're looking at their segmentation, and how they're achieving that target audience reach is a big part of what you sort of talk about with your outcomes as well. And like I said, I was kind of more on the analytics side. I was more looking at user behavior and things like that. It makes me particularly sensitive to things like attrition and survey fatigue, for example. Anytime we're giving a lot of questions, throwing a lot of questions at those learners, I've looked at the back end data, and I can see how every time you're asking them to answer, every time you're asking them to click, every time you're asking them to take another action, it is a point of attrition. You're losing a little bit. So as much as I want all the data I can get from that analysis side of me, I'm also very sensitive to how we ask those questions and how many of those questions we're presenting them and how meaningful those questions are. So, my my saying is always, only ask a question if you really want the answer. And sometimes I think that that's not necessarily happening with some of the medical education companies. They're just, they're trying to be efficient, right? And they're looking for solutions that are scalable. So they build an evaluation form, for example, and they want to use it in every single activity that they do. But sometimes those questions aren't well aligned to the audience of a particular activity. So I'm a big advocate for making sure we're asking questions of that audience that we want the answer to and that we can use to, tell our story in the outcomes presentation.
Can you give an example of questions that people like to ask but aren't necessarily need to knows, they're nice to knows?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've definitely seen, and a lot of these, like I said, tend to get buried in the evaluation form as opposed to maybe some of the pre-post polling and things like that. Those tend to be more relevant because they're aligned to the learning objectives and things like that. But in the evaluation form, because they do tend to just kind of build a form and then populate it over many activities, sometimes they'll ask questions that I think would be better served in like a survey to their learners like once or twice a year, like things about their interests, right? Like how they like to consume content, or, how they use some of the, downloads that are offered, if there's resources or PDFs that are being provided, things like that, and I think that's a fine question to ask. It's not that it isn't interesting. It just probably doesn't need to live in a space where it's being presented every single activity. We've done some work around ways to ask questions around barriers or intent to change, but I think people get really overburdened with qualitative, like open field data where they get to volunteer their answer. And so instead they, populate a number of multiple choice or check all that apply options, but they're very generic. And so we collect the data and we'll report it, but it doesn't become part of the conversation, and it doesn't become part of the texture of that story. And so in that sense, I feel like it's sort of a wasted question because we're not leveraging it in any way.
So I want to pick up on something you said there just to make sure that I'm clear that I understand what you said when you were talking about people getting overwhelmed with, open-ended questions. Are the people getting overwhelmed the people answering the questions or collecting the data?
Oh, I meant the analysts. Yeah, that's a good question.
Right. Yeah.
When you ask an open-ended question, you're going to get, a fair amount of people who just sort of opt out of that opportunity by giving, an NA or, some kind of filler feedback. And then you also get, a lot of people who give you lengthy responses, and some are more relevant than others, obviously. And it's just one of those things that has to be analyzed by human eyes, like kind of looking through it and like figuring out which of these responses are relevant, which are going to be relevant to this particular therapeutic area that we're educating on too, because just because you work in psychiatry or GI doesn't mean that this particular topic is the only one you're interested in. So learners will take the opportunity to give feedback on like a wide variety of interests that may or may not have relevance to the topic that you're reporting on. And so all of that context and all of that like kind of reading through the feedback that you get can be very time consuming and can be overwhelming for the people on the analysis side.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I'm familiar with many of the tools that you can use to help you do that kind of analysis. But even with, computer assisted data programs, it's still very time consuming to make sure that you're thoroughly reading, that you're getting the meaning, that you are, kind of coding and tagging appropriately. So that was a bit of a tangent, but I was curious there. And it's one of the things that I do hear a lot from people in terms of, we want to ask open-ended questions, we want qualitative data, but then what do we do with the data? We don't, really know how to handle that.
Yeah, and there are definitely methodologies for that kind of data, but it's not as widely used in our space, I think. It's not something that tends to get discussed very often either. Mm-hmm. And so I think what people end up doing is just sort of parsing for some quotes here and there, and those are really valuable too, like not to discount like actual direct quotes, but I think a lot can get lost in the volume of response feedback that gets kind of put aside in the pursuit of just like those couple sound bites,
Oh, I agree. A lot of that data is very rich. So you've been in the industry, a reasonable length of time, and worked with different providers, and you're an independent. How would you say the role of data and analytics has changed, over the last 10 years or so?
It's changed a lot since I started. So like I said, I started in the marketing group, but we were kind of the keepers of the data already. So it kind of naturally fell to us to produce these, they were basically quarterly data. I would call them almost outputs more than, like a report or an outcomes presentation. And it was just level 1, level 2 data, which I don't know if I should give some context around, Moore's levels of participation and eval satisfaction data.
We can make sure to, include some language there in the show notes, but just kind of flagging up here that when you are talking about levels, you're talking about Moore's outcomes framework.
Moore's levels, yeah. So, that was at the medical education company I was with at the time. That was kind of the process of just generating on a quarterly basis participation and evaluation data and spitting these outputs because that was all that was really being looked for at the time. There just wasn't a lot of focus on it. And they're just much more elaborate now and more visually engaging, which I think is great, and more of a presentation than just a report. There's a story element to it. There's a visual engagement piece of it. And so I think that they're much richer than they were before, but that comes with challenges too.
What kind of challenges?
Time is a big challenge.
Of course.
The time to put them together, it's a much more almost bespoke process of really looking at each activity and what was the intention there and putting, context around the data and giving them something to connect it to that isn't just a metric kind of sitting on the page, right? Mm-hmm. I think for my purposes and what I tend to advocate with all of my clients too is when they're building their review process for, how they're drafting their reporting is to really lean into a collaborative approach and make the argument to the other departments that are involved in building these programs of why that approach is needed. So, I'm very experienced in survey design and data collection methodologies and reviewing, question items and knowing where to place them in the content so that we can get the best capture of data and things like that. But I'm not a subject matter expert, and I wasn't probably the one that was designing why we picked a certain type of modality for this content. And that sort of input can be really valuable in telling the story, like why did we use this format and what was that meant to communicate to the learners, or how was it supposed to help reach them better and things like that. And that can really get lost in a long production timeline, right? Mm-hmm. So by the time you get to the end, right, where it's time to put the data together, the reasons for all of that stuff, you have to go back to the original people that put that together and really talk about like, okay, well, what was meaningful here? Because you don't want to lose that in the report either. If it just, like, let's say you have a complex curriculum and there's a number of activities and they've launched in kind of a staggered formation, just dumping a list of activities into, here's all the components of this program doesn't really tell the same story as how you use that, feedback from one activity to be kind of formative in the future content.
Sorry, can I pause?
Activities.
Sorry. I think I captured your content there because it's separate recording. I have a problem with FaceTime, which keeps interrupting, and I haven't figured out how to get it off my Mac yet. So that's why I was panicking. But I got your what you were saying was recorded.
I can repeat part of it too if we want to back up.
Yeah, no, I think we're good there. So one of the things I did want to ask was, well, there's a couple of things there. What's your sense of, you talked about Moore's outcomes framework. What's your sense of, how widely spread that is? I mean, it seems from my perspective, on the writing and research end that it's pretty widespread, or at least people talk about it, fairly widely within the field. But because you work with different people, you get to see what kind of outcomes frameworks education providers are using. So what's going on in the field?
I think
what are you
that's
seeing?
very common. Yeah, especially from a reporting standpoint too, because there is a nice kind of linear logic to the way Moore's is designed. So from a reporting standpoint, it's kind of nice to organize the data that way too, of this is who came, and here are the demographics that we know about them. This is how they felt about, the content, and then we get into 3s and 4s of this is actually what they learned, and then into a little bit more of, well, from the medical education side, there's, when you're getting into 5 and 6, like some of that ends up being more subjective or self-reported, or based on follow-up data that you have to collect, later down the road and things like that. But I do like the kind of linear organization of Moore's, and I think it's pretty widely used that way too. But I also know that people that are coming into medical writing from, other fields and things like that may not be as familiar. So that's why I kind of wanted to make a point to define it. I've also done a lot of training for people that are coming into this space, either as people that are developing content and writing question items, or people that are doing the kind of work that I do, where they're putting reports together and they're learning how to analyze the data and organize it.
Oh, I'm glad you did talk about it to give that context. Are you seeing other evaluation frameworks? I know that, Kirkpatrick's model is a model that some providers use. Do you see that much? Are you seeing other models being used in the field?
Seen a lot of it. I do, we just talked about kind of coming back from the Alliance annual meeting and things like that. And so I think it gets talked about a lot in different sessions. And I think there is probably an opportunity to incorporate that more. I like the discussions that people are having around it, but in terms of what actually happens at the time that they're, collecting, organizing, and reporting the data, I feel like the Moore's model is still the most prevalent organizational kind of model that I see being used.
And there's a kind of unification or a kind of unity there in using that model, across different programs, across different providers. For a long time, the field didn't really have a standard or a commonly used model, and we've reached a moment now where a lot of people are talking about a unified or a standardized outcomes framework within the field. What's your perspective on that?
It comes with its pros and cons, I guess, is what I would say. I think that the effort is, and the intention of it is really great for our space, because it is difficult, I think, for people to know how everyone else is defining their metrics, especially when everybody has different platforms that they're using. And from the back end side of that, when you're just kind of looking at the data and where it's pulling down points, like important points of when did they reach actual content? Okay, now let's call them a learner. Like when did they answer this question? Okay, now let's call them like a completer, or hitting the end of the content, or when they do the attestation. So I think that it is helpful to have those types of definitions out there. But there's also lots of, like I said, different platforms, and they have different capabilities. And there's also learning modalities that aren't really part of an LMS system. So when people are talking about using social media or different ways of reaching learners, and so there's a helpfulness in terms of standardizing some of how we define the basics, but then there's a place where it becomes, I guess, a little limited in that it can't, or at least to this point, right? The plan is for this committee to continue developing definitions for things. So maybe we'll get there, but there is a limitation currently when an activity is designed to use a different format or modality, and being able to then conform to a standard set of definitions.
What kind of things are you seeing? You mentioned social media. What kind of, approaches to outcomes measurement are you seeing among providers who are using social media, or something a little different that isn't part of a kind of standard LMS platform? Of course,
Yeah.
to your point, LMS platforms are very variable in terms of what they offer, but
Just
yeah.
on their own, for sure. Yeah. And then with the social media, I really like the idea of trying to meet the learners where they are, because again, from that sensitivity from the marketing perspective of seeing how hard it can be at times to push learners through a rigid LMS system. And it's just, it's not necessary. I think they're telling you with their attrition that isn't where they want to be to learn. And so I know that there's been some debate about how legitimate is social media as a potential conduit, right, for this data, and are people going to really learn from this and things like that. And I think that the early data is suggesting that they do, and just in the amount of participation that these providers are seeing, it's being welcomed. And I just think that that's a really important way for us to move our field forward, is looking for ways to be flexible and ways to meet those learners where they are. That does present some challenges with, like, what are the significant metrics in reporting that then, and being able to tell that story. And I've seen varied ways that providers are deciding, like, what they want to report. I think that there's value in some of the basic metrics of, how engagements, right? Like how many people came, how many people liked, how many people posted or retweeted, and the rate at which some of that stuff is happening. I think there's some value in that too. But we'll have to figure out ways to go deeper than that initial data and look for probably in more the qualitative realm of, like, really, like, highlighting some of the feedback that you get and things like that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, actually, because some of the qualitative platforms that are out there for data collection and analysis do allow, depending on which site you're using, which social media site you're using, but they do allow retrieval for certainly publicly available data. And I guess if you're setting up some kind of private space on social media, that capability is there as well, so that you can pull that qualitative data and really do a deeper dive into not only how many people are talking about topic X, but what they're saying and what the sentiment is around what they're saying. And I like what you said about, I am drawn to, the idea that, learning is social. We know that, there's a fair body of research on that now, and we benefit when we're able to kind of, participate collectively with others in the moment, in sort of, I guess, both real time and asynchronously. I did want to ask, what you're seeing as best practices in outcomes measures and data and analytics collection and reporting. I guess there's two questions. What do you recommend that providers use to evaluate the effectiveness of CME and CE programs, and what do you see as best practices?
So from a best practice perspective, I think that my advice would be the best thing that you can really do is start thinking about it early. Because I think that I wouldn't say, always use a p-value or always measure effect size. Like, I don't really think that that's particularly valuable when you think about the diversity of activity formats and design and platforms and things like that. So those can be helpful benchmarks and they can be useful analyses some of the time. There are other times, depending on the design, that other types of, maybe leaning into more qualitative feedback or things like that would be more useful. I think that it's important for providers not to get too hung up on things like a large N value. Like, you have to have a ton of people do something in order to be able to demonstrate the magnitude of the value of the education. So I think it's important to be flexible, and the best way, I think, to think about a best practice is starting thinking about it early when you're designing and you're kind of kicking around, okay, this is the topic we want to cover and this is the gap that we've identified, and what is the best learning modality for addressing that, and given the content that we're going to put together, what kind of format do we want. I think that's the time to start thinking about what sort of data can we collect in these different formats and what's possible, right? And because that tends to not be as much of the discussion in the earlier phases, I think that at the end of the road, then people kind of just lean into those tried and true, like, oh, we just want to see a big end value and a big, a low pre and a high post and, that kind of stuff. But I think that can be sort of limiting, even for the people doing the analysis. It can be kind of limiting when that's all that's available to you, because sometimes the activity could have been better served, measured differently.
And sometimes it seems, or at least I think, I've seen this on the writing side of things, it seems that especially larger providers do have their tried and tested approaches that it's almost a kind of plug and play. And so there's that trope of, begin with the end in mind, but sometimes that end it does always seem to be the same. We're always looking for the same kind of outcome versus what I'm hearing from you is a more nuanced approach, which actually begins with looking at what's going to align with and meet the needs of this particular group of learners, this particular learning activity for this particular topic.
Well, so when you talk about that plug and play kind of format, that is a reflection of them having thought about it at some point, right? So they worked up their process, they selected an LMS, they developed, a data collection plan and a methodology, but then it became this scalable solution that they started using all the time, right? And so what I'm suggesting and kind of advocating for when I talk to my clients and things like that too is it's fine, because a lot of us have a lot of work to keep up on and things like that. It's fine to have those things established. But when you want to keep moving things forward and you want to keep finding ways to be dynamic and to, to think about the learner and what they need and what they want and how that changes over time and how the demographic is shifting among clinicians, then use some pilot programs as an example of,
right.
You can't be thoughtful maybe about every single individual activity if you have a lot going on, but pick some opportunities where you can be creative. And pretty soon that might become then something that becomes the standard, and it just expands your offering. So in the beginning, maybe it's a pilot and a one-off, but you learn from it and you develop some processes around it and establish, what you want your metrics and your analysis to look like. And then that becomes one of the offerings instead of just, the single way that some providers are working.
Oh, and I appreciate that you took that plug and play, because I think, I wasn't implying criticism, but that could definitely be inferred. So I'm glad that you actually picked that up and teased out that distinction, because I think that's really helpful for listeners. Can we talk about the distinction between formative and summative outcomes, and when the kinds of scenarios where either of these approaches might be valuable?
Absolutely. So I think from, like I said, my experience is more on the medical education side, but I know that there are lots of different types of providers, and so their opportunities for how they use either one or both can be different. I think on the medical education side, it can be difficult at times to employ formative assessments, especially if you're thinking about using them kind of in a longer running curriculum and kind of using that feedback to help inform content in future activities or, future interventions. Because you don't have the same captive audience that you do, say, if you're, doing the education for a facility or something like that. So there can be some limitations with that, but I've seen it used in kind of a longer running, like a staggered release of curriculum multiple activities. I have seen it used, and it can be really helpful, and I think it's great to get that kind of feedback from the learners as you're going along, so that you can then work with content and faculty to form things out in the future or address questions that maybe the first activity left people with some questions, and so let's talk about those questions the next time we interact with them. The difficulty can be, do you get the same people once the second activity or the third or the fourth are released?
Yeah.
So when you're trying to match that back to the earlier respondents, that can be kind of tricky. So I think that is where a lot of MECs tend to rely on the summative version of just at the end of it all, give us the feedback on what you think.
And you've talked a little bit about, using outcomes reports to inform, future direction for education programs and activities. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the things that education providers can do to really use their outcomes results to inform decision making?
I think that's kind of the key role of what an outcomes report should do. I mean, it is going to talk about how the program performed in terms of, did it get the right people and enough people and all those types of things, and then demonstrate what sort of learning happened. And I think that's all, obviously very important part of it. But getting that feedback and looking both in the quantitative data of where you can see some persistent needs or, some stubbornness to, move into thinking about, certain therapies for patients and things like that. So definitely using the quantitative data, but also the qualitative feedback can be so valuable, again, if we think more about how we design our evaluation forms and when we're collecting that summative data, like what do we want to hear back from them and how can we really use that in the story and in the presentation of what should happen in the future. Sometimes I think, again, we look for scalability, right, and efficiencies, and so we ask things in a way that, works at the time, and then we don't stop to think about how it's going to work in the future or how it's been working because we've had it that way for a decade or more. One example I guess I could think of is when we're evaluating the faculty presenters, right? We ask frequently as just sort of 1 to 5 Likert scale question about how well they thought that the presentation, the content was presented by the faculty member. And one way to kind of change that up is to say, give it an open field response and ask the question a little bit differently. What's one word you would use to describe the faculty presenter? And you're going to get a lot of garbage that way too, stuff that you can't use or ways that people opt out of that question. But then you're going to get feedback that's useful and valuable. And you can think about different ways to ask questions like that for a number of typical questions on the evaluation.
You've talked about some of the challenges that providers have in relation to outcomes, scalability, how and when to use, qualitative approaches. What are some of the other challenges that you see that education providers have in developing a robust outcomes framework, and how can they start to think about addressing them?
I think that they're getting pulled in a few different directions, right? So there's a lot of, what technical capabilities do you have, given how you're going to collect data, how you're going to distribute the activity, et cetera. What if you have a grant supporter, what kind of data are they looking to see returned? And then what do your learners actually want to participate in? What do they want to do, and how easy is it to sort of, steward them through like a full activity with its questions and things like that. So, and then there's the tail end of now you're left with this big pile of data and you have to figure out how to organize it and how to distill some sort of meaning and message out of it, which, can be the challenge. And I think that's where some of my advice sort of I'm a big fan of scalability. Like I want to find efficiencies. That's a big interest of mine, is establishing a process that then can free people up to do other things. But what I think that they should be freed up to do is start evaluating things like qualitative feedback and think creatively about activity design and things like that. So it's what you do with that scalability and how that actually supports you and being more bespoke in other things, other pursuits, the next activity that you design, that kind of thing. So I think that I'm sympathetic to the amount of, information that's coming back in, and how those providers are, then left with like, oh, wow, we have data from so many different things, and now we have to figure out how to organize that and present that in a way that feels cohesive and useful.
And sometimes in practice, what happens is that all of that information is handed off to the writer to make sense of it. Not all writers have an analytic approach to, or might feel that they don't have permission to draw on their analytic skills because, they're hired to write. What would you say to writers in particular, or other people who kind of touch outcomes, who have a role in shaping the story and doing the analysis and the interpretation and finding meaning in the data? What kind of counsel would you give them in terms of where to start and what should they be thinking about?
So no one should be doing this in a vacuum, is kind of my advice. And I've had a lot of success with actually having calls. Like, instead of just forwarding a deck that's been, set up with the data, and here's the pre-post and here's what it looks like, and then, asking them to make of it what they will. I think that having a call, and I know nobody wants to have to schedule more and more meetings on their calendar, and it doesn't have to happen for every single program or every single activity, but when there are certain things that were really specific or maybe different about what they were hoping to accomplish with that activity or hoping to be able to say at the end, I think it warrants a conversation. I've had a lot of success in sitting down for, even 30 minutes with the content person or the person that is going to be the one actually presenting the results, like into the stakeholders and things like that. And that's a good opportunity too to revisit, because one thing I am also kind of aware of is how long ago it might have been that person writing the content put that program together.
Absolutely.
And so then to bring your mind back to what was the intention at the time? What were the gaps that were identified at the time? What was the hope for this format at the time and what it could do and how it could be different? And so a 30-minute call to kind of rehash some of that and go through it together as a participation between the person who did the data analysis and the person who put the content together, and then even the person who's going to be talking about it, talking it through and presenting it. I think that can be really valuable. And again, I know that can't happen every time, but anytime that it does, I feel like I learned a lot. Like I know a lot about the data, and I know a lot about how we surveyed and how we collected it, how we analyzed it, but I'm not a content expert. And so being able to sit down with the writers and go through, like, what is the meaning of this? Or like this, this question, this question item didn't perform well, and you can see some confusion in the data, but why is that? And being able to get that context back from them is so valuable. Maybe it was a situation where the faculty presenter wasn't as clear as they should have been about where the optimal answer was. Maybe it's a situation where there's just a lot of debate in the clinical space about what the right way is. So even if we're educating and we think we're being clear, there's a little bit of resistance to having that one optimal answer. Maybe they think that there is more of a variety of choices. And so just getting that back from the content expert is so valuable in how to frame those results for the audience for the report.
Oh, that's really helpful. What are the things that we haven't touched on that are important and that you would want listeners to be sensitive to and aware of when thinking about the role of outcomes in moving the field forward in continuing medical education and continuing professional development?
Yeah, I would say that the main pieces of advice that I would have when it comes to maybe designing your own outcomes program, your own collection methods, or your own template, right, for how you want to report these things. Transparency is a big one for me. I'm again in favor of that. The efforts that the OSP glossary is making in sort of defining things, but if you define things differently because you have some capabilities in your LMS that are different and they haven't been covered by that glossary of definitions, then be clear about how you're defining it. If you're using different kinds of platforms like social media to reach your learners, then be clear about what that means. And so I think as long as you're transparent, I feel like there's still a lot of flexibility in how you define the impact and meaning of your activity and your metrics. Using sound defensible methodologies. There's a lot of kind of extrapolations that are done lately when they're calculating like potential patient impact, for example. That's one I see a lot.
Right.
Where they're kind of taking an average number of, from the respondents and then multiplying it over, the total learner group, things like that. I think that that's fine to do, but I think that you want to be conservative in the way that you do that, and be reasonable and sit back and look at that number and make sure it makes sense. Like, the number of patients impacted should not be greater than the known universe of patients with that condition, right? Mm-hmm. Be reasonable about your extrapolations and again, be transparent about how you calculated it. So I think that can be really helpful when people are first kind of like setting up or maybe adding a new way that they're analyzing something and thinking about how did they want to define that. Mm-hmm. And then just really use it as an opportunity to highlight your strengths, right? So the outcomes report is a report. It has data. It should be, organized and things like that, but it also should have an element of story and context. Mm-hmm. And it is your opportunity to kind of talk about if anything went wrong, be open about that, but then also use it as an opportunity to talk about what went right and really like talk about, highlight those strengths of what you were able to do. I see people get a little bit hung up sometimes on, again, because we're looking for those efficiencies and that scalability, that they kind of start to rely on things looking a certain way every time. So they expect a low pre or baseline score, and then they expect to see a really high post. And when that doesn't always happen, I think it's important to kind of step back and look at the clinical context for some of those things. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the first knee-jerk reaction is to say, oh, was there something wrong with this question? Or was there something wrong with the way it was presented? And maybe, maybe that is a problem. But I think sometimes the context needs to be considered too. So an example I like to use is if you see some, baseline in the 50 or 60+% range, is it a problem? Like, well, if we're talking about an oncology program and I'm a patient with breast cancer, and I have a 1 in 3 chance of walking into an oncologist's office and having them not know the optimal treatment for my particular circumstances, I think that's an unacceptably high risk, and that is a place that needs education. So is that too high of a pre-test score? It kind of depends on the situation.
Right.
And I think it's important to kind of step back and look at that data from that context too, because that can give us a lot of information that we would want to share, when we're presenting that activity.
For people who are interested in learning more about outcomes and how they're used in the CME CE field, do you have resources that you like to direct people to?
For people that are learning, that are just interested in getting better at
or perhaps new to the field and are looking for some kind of introduction.
I've done a lot of one-off training as someone that was kind of building an outcomes team and things like that, and I can't say that there's any like specific resources that I usually direct people to. I often actually use presentations that came out of the Alliance. I think that there's a lot of value in some of the how-to sessions, and we tend to do them pretty frequently, right? Which is helpful because there's always people coming into the field and it's new to them, right? It may not be new to the people that have been around a long time, but it's new to them. And some of the decks are really great step-by-step tutorials on how to do certain things, what an effect size actually means, how to calculate a p-value, how to find calculators online that help them do that without having to, build complex formulas on an Excel deck, things like that.
Right. Right. And anything else that we haven't touched on that you want learners to know about, listeners to know about?
I guess I would just say that it's really important to keep trying new things, and that is not always the easiest thing to measure or the easiest thing to report or demonstrate the value in, but taking risks and trying to meet people where they are and try new formats and experiment with the kinds of education that we're providing, I think is really important. I think the scalability is useful and the efficiencies are incredibly helpful in our day-to-day, and it can also help us collect data that we can aggregate over time, which could be, an opportunity for some exciting analyses and things like that. But taking just a little bit of your time aside to think about new ways and not being so worried about, well, if I can't report it the same way that I've reported all of these other things, are we going to be able to say anything strong or useful about it? I think going into it not knowing for sure how you're going to report it, when you're first piloting something, you'll learn. You'll learn what data comes back, and you'll find things that you want to repeat, and you'll find things that you want to try differently the next time. And if everybody out there, all the different providers, are just thinking once in a while, like some percentage of their time about how to do something a little bit new, a little bit different, even changing up the questions that they ask just to see what kind of feedback they could potentially get from learners that would be a little bit new or a little bit different, I think that is incredibly helpful for all of us.
A rigorous but relaxed approach.
Yeah, I guess, that's a really nice way to put it. Yeah.
Angelique Vinther, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom about outcomes with listeners of Right Medicine.